I had been at Andrews University. I was nearing my end of my 5-year degree, not because I was slow, but it was a 5-year degree. And I had been dating this girl, and we were coming to the place where we started talking about marriage. And she lived in a few states over. She wasn't going to Andrews University, and she was flying in for the weekend. And I said, Lord, we're nearing that stage of where we are to decide what our future is together. And one of the things I had learned a long time ago from my mother is pray about everything. And so I was praying hard about that. And I said to the Lord, Lord, if she comes and we have a wonderful weekend, beautiful friendship weekend together, Lord, I know that this is the person I'm going to ask to marry. But Lord, if you break us up this weekend, here's your opportunity. If you don't want us together, you break us up and I'll lead. Yeah, Christina, you've heard this story before. Yes. And so she came for the weekend. We had a wonderful weekend. We went to church together. We just had an awesome weekend together. And it was coming to the close where I was having to take her back to the Chicago airport so she could fly out. And as we were driving after this beautiful, wonderful weekend together, I'm thinking in my head, Lord, thank you, because it was just two people that really enjoyed each other's company together. And as we're going back, we're driving back, and I had this huge American boat of a car. It could fit 6 people in there very comfortably, and all the luggage too. And I'm driving her back, and we're talking, and she did not believe in wearing seatbelts, so she was right beside me on the bench seat. And as we're driving down the road, my arms around her, very casually, because not 10 and 2. It was very casual. And we're talking, and we like to get into deep subjects. And as we're talking about a deep subject, we talked about healthcare. Me being a Canadian, growing up with free healthcare, well, corporations pay for it, I loved our system because no matter who you were, you could get treatment. Her being an American, she loved the American system. And so I asked her, I said, well, what happens if somebody has cancer and can't get any treatment for that? And she went, oh, well. And I said, well, that's really selfish to say, oh, well. And I looked over, and she was no longer sitting beside me. She was at the opposite end of the bench there, just looking at me like that. And I don't know why this came out of my mouth. I don't know. God had to be there. But I looked at her and I said, I guess it's over. And she said, yes. And I was just amazed that came out of my mouth. That was not what I wanted to come out of my mouth, but I just looked over and saw in her eyes, it was over. We drove there. I actually walked. That's when you could walk people to the gate. Walked her to the gate, and I was tearful. She was tearful, and we were just like, what's going on here? What is going on here? I say goodbye to her. I give her a big hug, and she goes. I'm driving home. I decided to take the toll road so I could get home to Andrews University a little bit faster. And I'm pouring out my heart in tears to God. I am just bawling. Yeah, grown men cry too, people. We also cry more as we get older. As the testosterone levels goes down, we start to get more in touch with our feelings. But I was pouring out my heart to God. I was crying. I was devastated. I was at that point where I was just saying, well, Lord, what next? What next? This is awful. This was the person I was going to marry. Why did this happen? And then all of a sudden, in an audible voice in the car, the Lord speaks very loudly, and he says, Paul, you asked me to do this. My eyes got big, and I said, Lord, I forgot all about that. We had a wonderful weekend together. I prayed that if we have a wonderful weekend, I'm going to marry her. But if you break us up, that's your leading. And lo and behold, we broke up. And as soon as I heard God say that, and it dawned on me what God just did for me, the crying stopped. The pain that was in my heart disappeared. I even called her that night and said, I just wanted to make sure you got home safely. She said, Paul, I thought I would never speak to you again. And I said, how do you feel about everything? And she said, Paul, it just feels right. And I said, me too. Me too. Years later, I met the lady that was to be my wife. And we were very eager to get married because I was pushing the 30 mark, doing a lot of praying at that time, going, Lord, am I going into adulthood single? And I was just praying. And lo and behold, my wife walked into my life. And so we were at Camp Friendo one weekend for youth to youth. I don't know if you guys remember that, an anti-drug program. And I brought my Crawford kids up. Kingsway was there with the Kingsway kids, and we were having a great time. And my wife and I decided, well, we're going to ask God for a sign if we are to be married. And so we asked for this ridiculous sign, went out on the dock and looking up for the sign, and we didn't see the sign. And we looked at each other. Maybe God didn't answer, but maybe we're not to be together. And so I go back to my car. Sonia goes to her room. She's crying. I'm just like, what's going on here? What next, Lord? What next? And lo and behold, Brian Lee comes walking over to my car saying, Paul, what's up? And I said, oh, Brian, get in. I had a little Honda Prelude. He comes in and he sits down. He goes, what's going on? And I go through the whole spiel of what I had just gone through. And Brian starts laughing. I said, Brian, why are you laughing? This is the person I want to marry and all that stuff. He goes, Paul, if God didn't answer, he's not saying yes or no. He just didn't answer. It's not time. And all of a sudden, Sonia comes walking down the stairs. And so I motioned to her to come, and she gets in the back seat of the car, and Brian starts giving us good counsel, saying, would you just relax and let God lead you in a relationship? Just quit pressing God and just let him answer. And we were like, oh, Brian, thank you. And by the way, I've had 2 crises in my life. That was one. There was another one where I was at Andrews University having a difficult time where I was teaching and a principal in Toledo, and Brian was there and gave me godly advice. So godly that he said, Paul, there's a person here on campus. Go find them on campus and talk to them. And I said, Brian, awesome. I opened up the door and there the person was standing there. So Brian was an integral part of my prayer experience and learning to trust in God. And so it was February, that was October when that happened. My wife and I waited. We were still praying about this relationship. I didn't want to marry anybody I didn't have God's blessing on, and Sonia didn't want to marry me unless God's blessing was there. So Sonia had been praying. It was February. We were having a snowstorm outside. It was a Friday night. It was about -20, which usually snowstorms and -20 in Ontario are not synonymous. It's usually a little bit warmer, but it was really cold out. And Sonia calls me up Friday night. I had just closed my Bible. I had my pajamas on. And I was getting ready for bed, and Sonia goes, Paul, what are you doing? And I said, I just finished reading my Bible, Sonia. I'm getting ready for bed and all that stuff. We're still got on church tomorrow to go to church. She said, yeah, that's good. Is there anything you want to do, Paul? And I said, Sonia, this is really, really weird. I don't know why I'm saying that, because sometimes things come out of my mouth. I have no idea why I'm saying that. But I said, would you like to go for a walk at the Oshawa Pier? The most ridiculous place I could think of. I was asking Sonia during a snowstorm, -20, waves probably crashing over the pier at that time, would you like to go for a walk? And all of a sudden, Sonia starts crying. Now, I'm not the best person at male-female interaction and communication. So as Sonia's crying, I'm going, Sonia, what did I do wrong? And I'm looking up to God, Lord, what next? Is this going to end the same way it ended with that other girl? And so I said, Sonia, I'm a male. You have to help me understand why you're crying. Did I do something wrong? Because if I did, let me know so I can apologize real fast. And so Sonia just said, Paul, be quiet and come get me. So I'm driving my little Prelude over in a snowstorm. By the way, it was a really great car handling in the snow. That's an advertisement for Honda, even though they don't make it anymore. So I go over, and Sonia comes out with her winter boots on, her jacket, and the mascara just dripping down her face. Kleenex here, Kleenex or tissue here. And she comes over to me and she opens up the car and she sits down, and I said, Sonia, I apologize if I did anything wrong, but what did I do? And she said, be quiet and just drive to the pier. And so I start driving, and I'm just like, I'm going through anxiety. The worst case scenario, because our brains love to go to the worst case all the time, is going, this is over. This is over. And Sonia goes, Paul, I was praying. I was praying tonight about you and me, because I'm not going to stick around if we're not getting married. I'm not wasting my time on a person I am not going to marry for the rest of my life. And she said, I was praying tonight. And so I asked the Lord, I said, Lord, if Paul asked me, and she said, I'm going to ask the most ridiculous thing to make sure that this is an answered prayer. If Paul asked me to go for a walk at the pier, I know this is the man I'm going to marry. Now, I'm not talking about dating, but I wanted to switch up a little bit what I talked about from first service to give the people that are doing the sound system and everything else a little bit of a change, and to talk to something that's very important to young people. Prayer, companionship, friendship. But I learned how to trust in God from that point on. Now, I still had that conviction that I needed to ask the Lord, because I needed that prayer, and the Lord answered it right away. When we come out of ourselves, people, we like to panic. And into the world today, anxiety levels are at an all-time high, because we are so inundated with information or lack of information or whatever they're saying out there, that our bodies are having a hard time taking everything in. We're getting information here, we're getting information here, we're getting this, we're getting that. This is happening on Instagram, this is happening on that, and we're just full of anxiety. In fact, the political situation of this world is not in a good place, at least the way we're seeing it. And it doesn't look good. It really doesn't look good. The social network that is going on in cities around the world, it does not look good. And sometimes I yell out to God, I say, Lord, what next? And God just says, Paul, be quiet and let me do what I need to do. There are times in my life when God has actually told me that. One of the times was my mom and I were praying for my brother. My brother was an alcoholic. I grew up in an alcoholic home. My dad was an alcoholic, recovered. My brother was an alcoholic. My uncle was an alcoholic. My other uncle on the other side of the family was an alcoholic. My grandfather was an alcoholic, so alcoholism was in my family. And my brother was drunk every single day. In fact, one day I was working at Branson Hospital, and he came over drunk as a skunk to spend the evening with me while I was trying to do rounds. And I was really worried for my brother, so my mom and I decided to really put some fasting and prayer into action. And we were praying. And I still remember the phone call. I'm living on the campus at Kingsway College. I think I was teaching at College Park at that time. And my mom calls me and goes, Paul, I have some bad news. And I go, what is it? Said, your brother's been in an accident. And I said, oh no, is he okay? He said, yeah, he's okay, but the girl that he hit is not. Doesn't know if she'll walk again. And I said, Mom, is it what I think it was? And she said, yeah, he was drunk. And so to make a long story short, my brother got sentenced to 3 months in prison, which was very light at those times. Now it would probably be 6 years. And so I told the Lord, and I still remember telling the Lord, I said, Lord, and my brother was getting ready to go enter the prison system. I said, God, I'm asking you to save my brother. What are you doing here? And the Lord told me, Paul, move out of the way and let me do what I need to do here. And little did I know that in prison, now I've told this story many times, so I never know where I told it and all that stuff, but I just felt compelled to tell it. My brother snored louder than any other person that I know in the world. In fact, he came up to visit me at Camp Frenda once when I was a young adult working at Camp Frenda, and he was in the cabin, and I had to wake my brother up and said, Rob, you got to go to the next cabin over. You're keeping us all awake in this cabin. My brother went in the next cabin over and still kept us awake. That's how loud it was. When he was being prepared for where they were going to put him, He was in a prison or a jail that had community bunks. So a whole bunch of bunks laid out in a row. They observed you while you were there, and then they would sentence you to one of the medium, maximum, or minimum security prisons around Ontario. And so my brother was sleeping and having a great time sleeping, but nobody else in the prison was having a good time sleeping. In fact, there was a group of people that rode motorcycles and had something written on their back there, angels or something like that came up to my brother the next day and said, "Rob, is that you snoring?" He said, "Yes, it is." He said, "If you snore like that tonight, we are coming over and we're slicing your throat." And my brother said, "I won't snore tonight. Trust me. Nope, I won't. And so I didn't know this was going on. And so my brother went to sleep. He didn't go to sleep. He laid down in his bunk and he stayed wide awake. "I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die." He said, "I'll sleep during the day, get as much sleep as I can during the day, and I'll stay awake the next night." And so that didn't happen. He stayed awake all day. And when it came to the next night to sleep, he was struggling because he couldn't walk around. He had to stay in his bunk. Couldn't walk around, and he's struggling, trying to keep awake, slapping himself, shaking his head back and forth, and doing everything he could to stay awake. But he was in a losing battle. By the third night, he was starting to nod off and waking himself up by snoring. And he knew that what that group of bikers said to him was true. And my brother hadn't prayed for a very long time, probably about 12 years. But he actually slipped out of bed onto his knees and he said, "God, I haven't talked to you for a while, but if you don't do something to get me out of here, I'm going to die here." He managed to stay awake the rest of the night, thinking about God. In the morning time, one of the guards came down to him and said, "Rob, the warden wants to talk to you." It's pretty important when the warden wants to talk to you. You're brand new in the prison. And so my brother follows the guard up to the warden's office, and he comes in, and he's standing before the warden, and the warden got to the point real fast. "Rob, you're an alcoholic, aren't you?" He goes, "Yes, I am." He said, "I hear there's a death threat on your life." He goes, "Yes, there is." He says, "I know the people that are making that death threat on you, and they are very serious that you will die here in this prison." He says, "I don't like my prisoners dying." And he said, "So Rob, I want to make a deal with you. I will parole you today under one condition. I'm going to give you a name of a psychologist that you need to go to and be counseled twice a week. If you miss one single day, you're going to come back here and you'll be here for 6 months." And he said, "I guarantee you, you're going to die here." Because those guys don't forget that, and they'll pass that on to whoever else is in here at the time. And he said, "I don't want to see you dead. Do we have a deal here?" And my brother said, "Yes, we have a deal." God did something incredible there because the counselor that he sent to was a personal friend of the warden. And he sent my brother to a Christian counselor. And as the weeks went by, my brother started to see the power of God work in his life. He never touched the bottle again and became a believer in Jesus Christ. To the day of his death, he served the Lord. And so sometimes God will take us aside, and when we're so paranoid of what's happening in this world, when we're so full of angst, we're so full of anxiety of what's going on outside of our doors, what's going on in our own lives, and we're asking God, what next? God is still on the throne. And you and I never have to worry about where we are with God. He is always there. And I'm going to challenge you to pick up the Bible and read the stories in the Bible. I'm a story person. If you notice, whenever I talk, I tell stories. One, people remember stories. There's a few characters in the Bible that told a lot of stories. The most important character in the Bible was Jesus, that used stories to convey great truths about the Father, about himself, about heaven, about the kingdom of God, about so many things. And so we remember stories. And one of the most important stories that I love to read and I love to preach about, and some people say, well, I've heard Paul speak to that before. I will speak it till I die. It's the story of Daniel. Because when I look at characters in the Bible, when I look at people in the Bible, there's people that panic and it doesn't end well for them. One group it ended fairly well with is when Jesus was on the mountain and he took some of the disciples with him. He said, guys, come here, come on with me. I'm going to take you up. You're going to see something amazing. And on the mountain, Moses and Elijah appear in glorified form. And the disciples were, this is where stupidity sometimes comes out of people's mouths. And they were like, well, what should we do here? We're here. Well, Jesus, is it good for us to be here? Maybe we should build some houses for them so that they can be in the houses. I'm going like, what a ridiculous thing to say. But sometimes when we're in a stressful situation, weird things come out of our mouths. Instead of just watching, let's watch what Jesus does with Moses and Elijah. Because Moses represents those that will die and be resurrected. Elijah represents those that are translated to heaven. They came to strengthen Jesus in the work that he needed to do going forward. So the story of Daniel is a powerful story because it tells me that when I'm at that place where I'm asking God, what next? What next, Lord? Why is this happening to me? I repeat the stories in the Word of God. Daniel was a person that went through all of his life. One, he's ripped away from his country. Two, as a teenager or young adult, and we don't know the exact wording, but we understand that he was probably made a eunuch at a very young age. Trauma number one, man. If that happened, whoa, Lord, no. Stop that. I don't want that to happen. And then trauma number two, he's put into leadership, and his three best friends are put in a space where they were asked to bow down to a statue of gold. And you see, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew the dream and they knew the interpretation. They knew that Babylon was going to fall. So were they worried about bowing down to a statue made of gold? Not too much, because they knew the three angels' message really well. The second angel's message, which is Babylon the Great has fallen, has fallen. So often we put so much attention into what has fallen and very little attention into who has risen. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had their eyes on who was risen, or going to rise one day, instead of the statue of gold. And we know what the story happens. They were thrown into the fiery furnace, but they came out untouched. And there was one in the furnace with them that looked like the Son of God, according to Nebuchadnezzar. Why do we worry sometimes when everything is falling apart in this world, but God is still on his throne? Jesus is still ministering in the most holy place. We should not be worried about what's going on around us. We need to be more concerned as who's on the throne. What's going on my behalf? Who's there for me? And remember what Christ asks us to do. He says, rest. Just rest in me. Just rest. Just rest in what I will do for you. And people, even if this world, even if we come to a place where we have to close our eyes on this earth and the second coming doesn't happen. My wife and I, when we got married, we weren't going to have kids because Jesus was coming back. That was almost 30 years ago. Still hasn't come back, so we're still waiting. Not putting any doubt in his coming, but I don't know the time. I don't know the time when that's going to happen, but I want to faithfully do that. As I read Paul's writings, Paul was at that point. He says, guys, Jesus is coming back soon. And I'm going, Paul, you were preaching that back then and expecting it back then in your lifetime, and it hasn't happened till now. But you know what? I'm still going to expect you, Jesus, because I can't wait till you come. I can't wait to see people raised from the ground. I can't wait to see people come to know you who have never known you. So Daniel's sitting there, and his not best friends, or his so-called friends, his working companions, notice that Daniel keeps on elevating, no matter what kingdom he's serving, keeps on elevating in power, and they didn't like that. So they conspired against him. They said, guys, we got to figure out, this Daniel can't be squeaky clean like he seems to be living. And so they looked for everything against him, and they couldn't find a single thing. Daniel was faithful in all things. And so they said, guys, let's find something about his God. And we know that he prays in the morning, we know he prays at noon, and we know he prays in the evening to Jerusalem where the temple is. And they said, let's do this. So they conspired with the king to make a law that nobody would pray to anybody for a while. And Daniel, knowing that the law's there, knowing that he could face the death penalty, does what he always does. I'm serving the risen God, the God that is on his throne, and that's who I'm going to pray to. And of course the guys get out their cell phones and they take, pictures of Daniel praying, and maybe some selfies there of him in the background praying to show to the king. And they go running to the king and said, King, look, he's praying to another God. And the king goes, oh no, my most precious Daniel, the one who faithfully serves me. And so the king realizes that he's been duped to put Daniel in the lion's den. The king tries reversing that. He tries to look for every legal loophole, and there's not a single legal loophole he can find. And so he goes to Daniel. He says, Daniel, I hope your God is able to deliver you. And he says, my God's able to. I serve a God that is bigger than you, bigger than this, bigger than Medo-Persia, just bigger. And they throw him into the lion's den. And we know the story because I'm not repeating the story again, but he makes it through the lion's den experience without a scratch. The king, though, was at his palace, having no rest day or night over what Daniel was going through. He was going through a conversion experience with God. You see, because he was king and he was also God at the time, he was not finding any peace in himself. And so he's just in angst, he's praying, he's sweating, he's not getting any sleep, he's pacing back and forth, he's wondering what is happening to Daniel, his friend. And after a sleepless night, he comes running. And the pinnacle of the story is the king has a conversion experience seeing Daniel's faith in action. Daniel didn't rally the troops to protest. He didn't write letters. He didn't do the things that you and I would probably do. He said, Lord, you're going to have to get me out of this. I'm serving you. And the king runs over and says, Daniel, was your God able to deliver you? And he goes, yes, my God was able to. And the king is just like, wow, those lions must have not been hungry. We must have fed them too recent in the place. Let's do some tests and throw some people in there and see if that happens. Well, he threw the whole group in that conspired. And they were all eaten that day because the lions were hungry. But Daniel had this incredible faith in the God of heaven. I see that faith repeated when Jesus went to the cross. Faith in his Father. And people, I want to tell you today, we do not need to worry about what's next. We don't need to worry about what we're going through, even in our classes. And I know the anxiety that happens when we're in our classes. And we're like, Lord, am I going to pass this class? And what's going to happen? I need you. And I got to tell you a story. Sorry, Christina and Mel, you've heard a lot of them over and over again. But that girl that I broke up with, we were taking the hardest psychology class there was, and I know some people will laugh, especially the biology and chemistry students, going, yeah, it's psychology. But I had Dr. Proctor. Dr. Proctor's a Canadian. And this was the hardest class that I needed to get done for one of my classes. You know Dr. Proctor? Yeah. It was hard. And my girlfriend at the time, I said, listen, Monday we have an exam. Can we study together on Sunday? She goes, no way, Paul. I'm going to study right now. And so I called her up for Vespers and I said, hey, listen, would you want to go to Vespers? She goes, no, Paul, I'm studying. I said, it's Sabbath. What are you doing studying on the Sabbath? And all that stuff. And she said, Paul, you're going to fail this exam if you don't study. I said, I will on Sunday. So Sabbath morning came and I called her up again and I said, hey, listen, can I pick you up for church? And she said, no, Paul, I'm studying. And I said, it's Sabbath today. You don't need to worry about this. God will take care of you. You study. He'll bless you. And she said, no, Paul, I am going to put you in the grave over this class. You are not going to do very well if you don't study. And I said, I'll study Sunday. Saturday night came along, asked her if she wanted to come out with our friends. She said, no, I'm studying. Sunday comes along, and I said, hey, listen, you want to study together? She goes, oh, I know your study habits, Paul. Nope, not going to happen. I'm studying here in the dorm. I'm quiet. Nothing's bothering me. I don't want to study with you. And she wasn't being rude or anything like that. She just, I would study for 5 minutes and then listen to the radio, maybe watch TV or do something else. And she would study, and I would really interrupt her. So I studied for about maybe an hour and a half on Sunday. As much as my brain could take, I studied. Monday morning, we went in for the exam and wrote the exam. She said, Paul, how did you do? And I said, I did the best I could. She said, oh, you're going to fail. You didn't study. And I said, but I took the Sabbath hours to rest in Christ. And I said, you should have done that. She said, nope, I'm going to beat you on this, Paul. You're probably going to get a 50, maybe a 60, maybe even a 40. I said, well, if I do, at least I rested. So later on that week, Dr. Proctor gave back the test, and he did something that was different that day. And he gave back the test. He put them all face down on people's desks. He says, don't look at them yet. Don't look at them. And I was just like, oh, no. I probably did fail. Probably with half the class failing. And so the girl I was dating, she, when he gives permission, she looks it over, and she turns it over to me. Paul, 93% in your face, Paul. And now, I was not the most studious person. And so I said, oh boy, this is going to be embarrassing. And I flip it over. And I said, 97%. And I said, and I only studied an hour and a half, but I spent my entire Sabbath with the Lord. People, do not fret about what God is doing in your life. Honor Him. Put your eyes towards Him. Keep your eyes focused on Jesus, and He will take care of you. One story before I go? Okay. James and Ellen White. I'm a history teacher on top of it. James and Ellen White were serving the Lord, but getting very discouraged. This was in the 1870s. They were talking to each other about leaving church work. Not just leaving church work, but starting a new church because they were so paranoid about what was going on in the 1870s. A lot of people were getting wrapped up in some of the conspiracies that were going on in time. They were getting wrapped up in world events and stuff like that, and Jesus was very little talked about. And so they said to each other, as he was working in the General Conference office in Battle Creek, Ellen White was writing her books, they said, we need a break. So they booked a vacation to Colorado. They were going to be gone for 3 weeks. I don't know whose house they were staying at or whose cabin they were staying at, but I do know that in the middle of the time that they were there, they failed to bring enough food for them. And she gave James a rifle, either that was in the cabin or they had brought with them, I'm not sure. James had to go out and get some squirrel to meet the hunger needs. So on Monday, squirrel will be served in the cafeteria. Anyways, but something happened to James and Ellen White as they started reading their Bible again. They started going through the New Testament and seeing Jesus in a new light that they had never seen before. And they started to get excited about Jesus again. So much so that as they were coming to the end of the 3 weeks, James and Ellen were looking at each other and they were looking at the water that the cabin was on. There was either a river going there or a lake, and they said to each other, we got to do what we got to do. Because they were seeing Jesus again, and a Jesus that their church had missed for a long time. So they went down into the water, and James took Ellen and baptized her for her third time. She was baptized as a young teenager. She was baptized when she came to the Sabbath truth. And she was baptized by her husband. And then she took her husband and she baptized James in the water. They came back on fire for Jesus. And because of their spiritual revival, they came back to the church and a spiritual revival broke out. James came to a point where he told Ellen one day, he said, I'm tired of preaching everything else. I am only going to preach Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And for the rest of his life, that's all he preached, is Christ and Him crucified. That was only a year and a half till he died. But Ellen White took that. She took that spiritual revival that they had gone through, seeing Jesus again. She took her husband saying, I'm only going to preach Christ and Him crucified. And for the rest of her life, if you read her writings, she preaches Christ and Him crucified. The most beautiful story of redemption comes from her writings about Jesus. So I want to tell you, no matter what you're going through, people, Jesus is on the throne. He's in the most holy place. He's advocating on our behalf. Not that anybody's advocating against us, but the devil is. Jesus is meriting the blood that He shed on our behalf and saying we stand in Him. We rest in Him. So no matter what you're going through, if you're at that stage where you're yelling to God, Lord, what next? Know that He's taking care of you. Even if it's not the direction you wanted God to take you, follow in the direction that He leads, and you will never, ever be disappointed.